All right, hello. We are back. Civics ain't dead yet. Okay. And For those of you tuning in again, this is, just two overwhelmed history guys that also happen to be overwhelmed, young dads, and we're doing this on the side, so we're trying our best. I'm here with the Sundance Kid, or Josh, whatever you want to call him, and he actually happens to be a 20th century expert. I think it's safe to say, and a closet Ike expert too. So we're here to talk about Iran tonight and the conflagration that is currently playing out in the Middle East. But we want to get just beyond the current event stuff too, right? Because you can get that from the news. So, Josh, I think we're here to talk about, um, what powers a president or a country has to go to war, what our Constitution says about it, what modern history has to say about it, but then also try to understand the relationship between the U.S. and Iran leading up to this point, right, where actual troops are being killed, missiles are being fired, that kind of thing. So, um, you know, Iran, throughout our lifetime, I mean, we're in our 30s, and Iran has kind of always been there as a boogeyman, at least in my conscious knowledge. Maybe not when I was a kid, right? But it's one of the big bad actors in the world, right? At least that's what we learn. It sits up there with Russia and China. I remember George W. Bush calling it part of this axis of evil, I think, which also included rogue states like Iraq and North Korea at the time. Then we kind of have this idea of the Ayatollah as this dictatorial regime, this kind of Muslim extremist regime that has always been antithetical and opposed to American interests at home and abroad, right? We all probably have the image of Iranians chanting "Death to America," right? Which is obviously not exclusive to Iran, but is very much publicized and popularized by Iran's first supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, right? So why do Iranians hate America so much, or why does this particular Iran regime hate America so much? And why do they distrust the West? I think is a good maybe starting point to ask before we get into the particulars of this conflict and how the U.S. goes to war in a situation like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think off the bat, it's important to say um, that you know, we're pretty outspokenly anti-Trump guys. Uh, we're historians who don't have any problem criticizing the U.S. I think that uh, is a hallmark of respecting your country, wanting your country to be the best version of itself, and being a patriot. Um, that does not mean that we support the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Absolutely not.
When I
Absolutely
saw the
not.
news that the Ayatollah was killed, I wasn't like, oh no, that's a good thing because that dude was a dictator.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yes.
sometimes, like, there can just be bad people all around. There doesn't have to be a good guy and a bad guy. Um, and
Well, and it's okay to say, Trump took out a bad dude the other day,
yeah,
right? Like, we can still critique the overall plan here. Um,
yeah. But getting to your point about like Iranians chanting "Death to America," I mean that's certainly my kind of formative understanding of this country and why, like, okay, well, why do they hate us so much? um so if you're thinking about Iran throughout the 20th century, um it really is, it suffers from a tug of war between Britain and Russia as two colonial powers who see it for its oil fields, which are some of the most abundant in the world, as I think we're all about to find out with the Strait of Hormuz being closed. That's like 30% of the world's oil production goes through there. Um, so massive oil fields in Iran, and the British started investing and building infrastructure there, like in the early 1900s. They formed the Anglo Persian Oil Company. That becomes the Anglo Iranian Oil Company in 1935 when Persia changes its name to Iran. Persia is kind of a Western imposed name for a small portion of the territory. So, the Shah at the time, the father of the Shah that we all know about from the 50s and 60s, he changes the name to Iran as sort of this nationalistic, um,
Hmm.
sovereign, nation building enterprise. Um, you get to World War II, the Soviets and the British, invade and occupy Iran, ostensibly for supply routes and oil fields.
That's what I was going to add. Is to protect them against Nazi incursions, in theory, right?
Yeah,
Kind of.
which it absolutely was, but
Yeah.
also like these colonial powers are vying for this oil anyways. Um, so what happens then is you get to the end of World War II, and there are various points in the 20th century where Iranians start dabbling with democracy. And technically, Iran is a constitutional monarchy coming out of World War II. But they do elect prime ministers, so it's like democratically elected prime ministers to an extent. And you get this guy Mohammad Mossadegh, who's elected prime minister in 1951, and he gets this idea in his head that Iranians should nationalize their oil fields and their oil
Right.
sector. Um, I should back up. The initial agreement between the British and the Iranians was like the British get roughly 84% of the profit from the oil. The
Okay.
Iranians are left with 16%. There's imperialism for you. So in the 50s, in 51, there's this nationalization movement for Iranian oil. And unsurprisingly, that doesn't fly with the British. So they go to Truman and they say, "Hey, let's do a coup." And Truman says, "No, I don't think so." And remember, at the time, the CIA was just established in like 1947. So the CIA is this kind of fledgling institution, still finding its feet.
And it's a
Uh,
very early stage of what will become the Cold War, right? So we're not like full on CIA operations in Latin America yet. Um, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So Truman says no, and then you know our guy, who we're gonna have to criticize pretty heavily this episode, Eisenhower, gets elected in 1952, inaugurated in 53. The Brits, Churchill goes to Eisenhower and says, "Hey, Truman said no, but what do you think about doing a coup?" And Ike's willing to play a game. So the Americans and the CIA and MI6 and the Brits, they basically oust Mossadegh, this prime minister, in 53. Um, and just a strange anecdote, the guy who kind of leads it for the Americans is Kermit Roosevelt Jr.,
Wow.
grandson of Teddy Roosevelt,
Yeah.
which is
I,
weird.
that on
Also,
all
like,
levels. Yeah.
yeah, why is it like I didn't know people were named Kermit? Um, but there you go. So yeah, I mean, the Americans
There's your
launch a coup.
trivia for the night. There,
Mhm.
that's your historical trivia for the night.
Yeah, and so 1953, the Americans launch a coup, oust Mossadegh, and kind of reinstall the Shah um, as. I mean, he was already the head of state technically, but now they kind of install him as a bona fide pro-Western monarch. Um,
Is
uh,
this the first? I'm picturing like the kind of the long list of Cold War coups orchestrated by the Americans. This is the first real one of those, right?
in the Cold War,
Yeah,
I mean, what Guatemala is like 54, maybe.
yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I'm thinking, right? Yeah.
It might be the first one. I
That's what
mean,
I'm wondering. That's a piece of trivia to dig up. But yeah, so we're kind of setting a precedent here.
yes. I mean, it's certainly not the first time the U.S. has tried a regime change in its history.
No, I didn't. Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, yeah. I mean, after World
Modern
War II,
Cold War coup. I think that's the question. Yeah.
I mean, I want to say there's more in the late 40s, but I don't know off the top of my head. Um, so yeah, so Mossadegh gets arrested. He's tried. He's convicted of treason. He goes to prison for like 3 years, and then I think he's placed under house arrest. The Americans installed the Shah as this pro-Western monarch, or you could say a puppet, I guess, to an extent. The Western powers as a whole retain like 50% of the oil through this thing called the Consortium Agreement of 1954. Um, the company I mentioned in the early 1900s, the Anglo-Iranian oil company, that becomes British Petroleum, or BP, as we know it today.
So that's gonna.
And then there's like 5 American companies that have a hand in the pot. The French, the Dutch are all involved. And so Iranians live under the rule of the Shah for 26 years or so.
Yeah.
And there is a period of modernization and secularization. A lot of infrastructure projects, land reform. There's this thing called the White Revolution. Women get the franchise. And if you Google like images or videos of Iran in like the 50s or 60s, it's like unrecognizable to what we've kind of grown up in the 21st century seeing in the country.
Yeah, it's an era
Very
of modernization. Yeah, in a way.
and consumerism. I mean, it comes to be known as the shopping mall of the Middle East. It really does. They really do take Western consumerism and run with it. The problem is that as you get into the 60s and certainly the 70s, the Shah becomes far more despotic. He becomes much more of an open tyrant. There's censorship, suppression of dissent. There's a secret police, which is kind of the hallmark that seems to always crop up, as we know all too well. Imprisonment, torture, executions. It just gets to be pretty nasty. And by 1975, then, he eliminates the multi-party system in their government, and it becomes a full-fledged one-party state. So, Iranians have been living under this for decades. By that point, they're fed up. There's a lot of internal dissent, obviously, from different groups, many of them clerical, the more religious theocrats. And so you end up with the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which puts in place the regime that has been governing Iran since then, right? And so you have basically 2 supreme leaders. The first one, Khomeini with an O, from 79 to 89, and then the more recent one from 89 until just a few weeks ago, or just a week ago, I guess.
Yeah.
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, right? So one of the things I also want to say real quick, just to wrap it up, I think a lot of Americans' entry point into U.S.-Iran relations is the Iran hostage crisis in 1979.
Yeah.
Certainly our parents grew up and that would have been all over the news. And it's a very hostile way to think about relations. Like, why is this foreign country kidnapping and holding hostage 66 Americans? And, no one's justifying that. But the answer is that there was suspicion that the Americans were going to try a second coup, again.
Try to reinstate a Shah. Yeah, yeah.
And it's precipitated in part because the Shah at the time had cancer. He was severely ill. And Jimmy Carter brings him over to the U.S., gives him state-of-the-art medical treatment, and he stays in the U.S. And then even today, the Crown Prince, the oldest son of the Shah, he's been living in exile in Potomac, Maryland, for like 40 years or however long it's been. So there's just an open, very public, and very televised relationship of support between the Shah and that regime that Iranians on the streets came to despise in the 50s and 60s and 70s, certainly in the latter half, and the U.S. government. Um, and it's also worth mentioning, real quick, the U.S. government did not acknowledge its role in the coup until 2013. So this was something pretty well known
Yeah,
for some time, but it didn't come until the Obama administration that like the government was like, yeah, that was us.
that's
We did
wild.
that.
Um, and point of order, I did Google it while you were talking there. It is the first successful coup orchestrated by the U.S. during the Cold War era. So there you go. Um, yeah, yeah. So there's a deep history here. I think is part of the key, um, and and to put a point on it, it doesn't justify you know Muslim extremism or or despotism in the current um, regime, but there's a more storied and complex problematic history between the U.S. meddling in Iranian affairs all the way back to the 50s, and before that, the British, right, who we kind of aided um, in the 50s to get the Shah instated. Uh, yeah, okay, that
Well, and it breaks
yeah,
down this dichotomy that we see in our media of, on the one side you have this authoritarian theocracy, and on the other side you have this freedom loving constitutional republic. And it's like, yeah, okay, but if you look at the history of these two countries, we propped up a dictator and
yeah,
suppressed their
yeah.
ability to democratize how they wanted to, and that leads to a lot of the resentment that they have towards us today. um, the challenge for Iranians today is that they also have no love for the current regime.
Current regime, which is equally despotic or more so. Yeah.
Yeah,
So they're caught between this rock and hard place of the West supporting this older dictatorial coup versus more lived history of modern times where yeah, it's a
yeah,
Islamic
and
regime. Yeah.
so I mean, we get to the point now, 2026. The U.S. is bombing Iran along with Israel. Many countries are involved. This has been something. I guess it also happened briefly in 2025, but this has been something on the radar of Israel and the U.S. for some time.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump, as he's shown over the last year or so, he doesn't really see Congress as an equal branch of government by any
Mm-hmm.
stretch of the imagination. Um, and so I wanted to bring up quickly, there's a Democratic senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, who is very vocal opponent of Trump in almost every respect. He goes on Face the Nation on CBS a few days ago, and he refers to Trump's actions and he refers to this new war as, quote, a war of vanity, a war of choice, and a legal war. And so, the first two of those three things can be debated, matters of interpretation,
Sure.
vanity, choice, sure, maybe. But
Mm-hmm.
the last one, an illegal war. I've seen a lot of people saying that, this is illegal what the U.S. is doing. And certainly it packs a bigger punch than calling it a war of vanity. So what would you say Senator Murphy's getting at when he's saying this is an illegal war?
Yeah. Well, I think on one level this is rhetorical, right? But on another level, it's I think it's hearkening to two different things, right? So on maybe the best way to talk about it is kind of like on an international stage, which we're not going to talk a whole lot about. There is there are procedures, especially in the modern era, right, with the UN. Um, there's coalition building. There's cluing allies in. There's justifying things on a world stage, right? And so I think on one end, someone like Chris Murphy or anyone who wants to critique Trump's kind of rash charge into conflict here in Iran would say, on the this is not how responsible partners in the world order behave, right? This is how unilateral um, belligerent states act rather than consensus building and negotiation. So you negotiate first, and you lay out the justifications before you ever launch into a war. And lots of modern U.S. presidents have done that. George Bush Sr. formed this epic coalition before he went in to Iraq with the first Gulf War. Even George Bush, in 2001 and then 2003 with Afghanistan and Iraq, formed what he called the Coalition of the Willing, right? So that there's kind of a diplomatic dance that takes place first on the international stage that, while it's not, calling that illegal to not do that, I don't think is the main point. I think what someone like Chris Murphy and people in Congress are saying is it's not actually constitutional for the U.S. president to launch a war on his own whims without consulting Congress first, right? And even that, I mean, constitutionally speaking, that is true, but it's a little bit more complicated in the modern era, as you probably know, Josh, right? That we have not actually declared war. Congress has not declared war since 1941. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, that was a kind of an easy ask from FDR, who was president at the time. He goes to Congress, and they pretty vigorously and almost unanimously declare war on Japan, and then eventually Germany and Italy, the Axis powers, during World War II. But since then, we've definitely had wars, but we have not declared any wars. And so that's where kind of this complicated modern era comes in. Because as the Constitution's written, if you read it, right, war powers rest with Congress. And that was intentional. The founders did not want a president acting as a king. Kings in Europe were famous in the 18th century for throwing their countries into unpopular wars and spending their entire, countries' coffers to fight these super costly wars in continental Europe, right? The British kings did this. The Spanish kings were famous for doing this. The French kings, all of them, right? And so the founders, when they set up the Constitution in the U.S., they wanted to make sure that the president did not have that same access to military power that kings did back in Europe. And so from a very basic level, that was the thinking, that Congress at least could vet the process of war. There would be more kind of players involved, so to speak. And even the most ardent pro-executive branch thinkers in the founding generation, people like Alexander Hamilton, are pretty consistent with other thinkers like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson on this, that like Congress has to be the one that controls when the United States goes to war. But as we know, that has slowly but noticeably changed over time, right? So in the 18th and 19th century, the president always appealed to almost always appealed to Congress for a declaration of war. There were times when presidents didn't, but it was usually small scale military actions. So think like the capture of Tripoli during the Barbary episodes. This is Thomas Jefferson's era, right? So there are Barbary pirates in North Africa. He sends the Marines over to essentially take them out with a coalition of Europeans, of course. And he does not seek to declare war on those pirates because the U.S. didn't want to recognize the pirates as a legitimate state entity, and B, it was deemed kind of a defensive move to protect U.S. shipping. So there are early examples where the president pushes the envelope on this. And, people point often to Lincoln and his kind of expansion of executive power. But even Lincoln, right? I've got a good quote here from Lincoln. So this is from a speech he gave earlier in his political career, 1848. He says that kings had always been involved in impoverishing their people in wars, pretending generally, if not always, that the good of the people was the object. But it is understood to be the most oppressive of all kingly oppressions, and they resolved to so frame the Constitution that no one man, even the president, that's me adding that in, should hold the power of bringing this oppression upon us. Right? So people like Lincoln, people like Alexander Hamilton, people like Jefferson, they all understood that Congress had the power to declare war. When that changes is not until after World War II, right? And this starts with Truman in Korea. Okay, so the United Nations had recently formed with the U.S. kind of backing this formation of a kind of an international body. The U.S. is obviously a permanent member of the Security Council, and when the North Korean communists attempt to take over the South Korean democratic government, Truman works with the UN rather than the US Congress to initiate a global police action to protect South Korean security, right? And so this eventually draws the US and its UN partners into a prolonged conflict in Korea, not just against the North Koreans, but against communist China, right? They fight Korea basically to a standstill, but it's never a war. It's a police action. Truman informs Congress that we are participating in this police action, and he does, a lot of work to kind of explain to Congress how this has been brought about at the UN level. And that's essentially his kind of gesture at following proper constitutional protocols, right? But no one really calls him to task because, by and large, at least in the early portions of that conflict, the Korean War is supported by the American public. That changes over time, right? Ike, does the same thing. So he gets us out of Korea. And you know this stuff better than I do, Josh. Feel free to jump in if you want. But he does get us initially involved in Southeast Asia, right, with some semi advisory roles with the Vietnamese and this fear of spreading communism there and fighting that off. This really escalates in the 60s after Ike's time, first with JFK, but then noticeably with Lyndon Johnson. And it's in 1964 that Congress grants the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which essentially gives Johnson military powers. So Congress cedes its military power in Southeast Asia and gives it to Johnson without him needing to seek a formal declaration of war. And that's really what gets us into an escalated conflict in Vietnam, right? So it's a president that leads us into that conflict. He still has to go back to Congress for those resolutions. He still has to go back to Congress for approval of troop deployments and monetary stuff. But this is how slowly over time congressional war powers erodes and presidents start to call the shots. Now, Vietnam, as we know, is a disaster for American personnel. It's a disaster for our allies in South Vietnam. And by 1973, the U.S. feels pretty burnt about this presidential powers in the Gulf of Tonkin and elsewhere in Vietnam. So they pass a response to this. It's the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which basically tries to claw back war powers for Congress. This happens to be the same year that Arthur Schlesinger comes out with a book called The Imperial Presidency. And so Arthur Schlesinger, if people don't know, back in the 60s, they used to actually, presidents would consult historians on things. Arthur Schlesinger is this weird hybrid of a policy guy, a presidential advisor, and also a presidential historian, right? And so his Imperial Presidency is a critique, basically, of the way modern presidents have expanded their war powers at the um, at the cost to Congress and the American people, right? So he lays out this argument that this has happened slowly over time, and we hadn't noticed it until the Vietnam disaster, and now it's time to bring back congressional war powers, so by limiting, the ability of presidents to make executive agreements instead of treaties, by curtailing the secrecy and executive privilege of the president, um, strengthening legislative oversight, all that sort of thing. So it looks like things are going to kind of go back to a more constitutional model after 1973, both with legislation and also the kind of this public opinion. But of course, that's just a blip in the long run. The issue really comes roaring back after 9/11, after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Um, the Patriot Act massively expands executive use of military operations, both domestically and internationally. The military operations that take place in Afghanistan and Iraq are justified as, well, in the modern world where technology is so much faster and communication is so much faster and rapid responses are necessary to something like a terror attack, the president has to be sitting in the Situation Room making the call at 3 a.m. sometimes and not consulting all of Congress. What if they're in recess? What if they're across the country? All of those kinds of people want quick action in the war on terror, and therefore presidents since George W. Bush have used that to their advantage to really take control of most war powers, it seems, on a functional level, even though the Constitution has not actually changed, right? So you've got everyone doing this. It's not just a Trump problem. It's both parties and all presidents from George W. Bush on have acted unilaterally in the Middle East, Latin America, Libya, all these places. So really, the main lever of power that Congress has left in terms of making war is the power of the purse, right?
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, please do.
Before we get into the funding? I mean,
yeah.
So my understanding is that part of the Supreme Court's kind of established that in addition to formally declaring war, Congress can establish these authorizations to use military force, or AUMFs.
Yes, that's right.
And there's there's numerous examples of them, but the one in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 in 2001 really becomes like the very controversial one. So I got a little blip of the text because it's still applicable today. There's no sunset clause to this one. There's no geographical limits, but the actual authorization from Congress says, in general, that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001. Great, understood. Or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. So, we're talking about future acts of international terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
It's now been like 25 years that this authorization has been in effect. In 2023, the Senate voted to repeal it, like 66 to 30, but the House did not agree with that.
Yeah.
And this is this 2001 AUMF is what the Trump administration has cited as justification for the Venezuelan boat bombings in the Caribbean. This is what they just cited a few weeks ago for Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, like every president, Democrat and Republican, has cited this in the last 25 years.
Well, because when you use a term, I mean, in the aftermath of 9/11, I think we can all remember that. Terrorism had a very particular meaning in the aftermath of that. What we have seen in the last 25 years, and particularly in the last year, right? What gets called terrorism now? You can call drug running terrorism. You can call the spread of a pandemic terrorism. You can call
Apparently, you can call
economic
protesters.
sanctions terrorism, right? Like
Yeah.
anything can be terrorism, right? Protesters can be terrorists. And so um, the rhetoric has expanded exponentially. And with that expansion of rhetoric comes the expansion of executive authority, right? Because the executive can always point and say, see, that's an act of terrorism, or that's a potential future act of terrorism. And therefore, I'm justified in taking out that threat preemptively, right? And again, right, if the spirit of the Constitution is all about checks and balances, there's not a lot of those built into that thinking, right? It doesn't matter who's in charge, right? It could be the best president we've ever had, it could be the worst president we ever had. There's no checks and balances if the president is the only one calling the shot. Or determining what a threat is or a terrorist is. That becomes obviously loaded with and fraught with problems. Yeah.
So the funding, though, that
Well,
does
I was
become one area.
yeah, I was all I was going to say about that is, I think we can all remember the debates that have happened in Congress probably from 2003 on, both in terms of, because this is how Congress has tried up until this point to retain some control over military action. It is in the power of the purse, right? How much funding they give to any particular conflict or operation, as they like to call them, um, or troop surges, right? So those troop surges that always were controversial votes when it came to Afghanistan and things like that. That again is tied to the power of the purse. How much funding are we going to provide? And so that's one lever that Congress still has. The problem with that lever, as you can probably anticipate, right, is that if as a congressperson, either a senator or member of the House, votes to not fund troops, that's very easily a political landmine, right? Because that's easy to spin in a way that says, well, Josh voted to not fund our troops, and therefore they've got fewer bullets and less protection and blah blah blah. So the power of the purse is still Congress's, but it's a weak bargaining chip, I would say, in the checks and balances uh, equation. The other thing too that we've seen this year, over the past 12 months, is that Trump has already shown very little respect for Congress's authority over funding in other aspects, right? I'm thinking of like the whole Doge saga, all of those canceled grants, um, all of the things that Congress agreed to fund that Trump then just didn't fund. And so it's unclear that Congress has even retained the power of the purse at this point, right? Trump has not hesitated to ignore that particular checks and balance. So if you think that funding is what's going to save us from a a, a rash war, I don't think that's actually going to save anyone. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ultimate conclusion is that, like, since the beginning of 2025, there's been countless things that the administration has done that are unconstitutional, illegal, and morally bankrupt. This one, you could say all those things, but he's not that so different from the last 3 or 4 presidents since 9/11.
He's exploiting the same gap and the same momentum that has been happening for a good quarter to half century or more, right? It's just some of the window dressing has been taken off now, right? Like most presidents up until this point had to go and make a case to the American people or make a case to Congress for why we had to invade Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction, even if that proved to be false, right? Or we had to go in and take out so and so because they were threatening U.S. interests, yada yada yada, right? presidents up until this point have at least made a demonstration or a gesture in that way, right? The way that Truman did with Korea back in um, the 1940s, right? But I think the difference this time is Trump has not really bothered to explain to Congress or the American people what it is he intends to do in Iran, except for a couple contradictory, posts on Truth Social or something. It's not like he's made an address to the American people. It's not like he's gone up to Capitol Hill to try to persuade anyone. Um, and so that is the only difference. But again, that might just be a difference in display than anything else. I don't know.
Yeah, and we can get certainly more into the who, what, why, when, and how. I think maybe this is a good place to stop for this episode and
Yeah,
pick it back up.
yeah. Lots to think about, and a lot of moving pieces still, right? Like, by the time we process this and people listen to it, things will have changed again. I think that's the problem with war, is it's unpredictable. So, but good talking through it, Josh.
For sure,
And
for sure.
we'll see you all next time. Thanks for tuning in.